everybody. Welcome to What Magic Is This? A podcast about magic, the occult, the esoteric, the paranormal, the supernatural, and the weird. My name is Douglas, and welcome to the first episode in the series of Books of Magic. And we are going to start this one off with an absolute bang, because this is something that I know so many folks have asked me about. Indeed, I get asked when people go to the website, what's this strange figure that you have on your website? Who is this Cyprian fella that you keep talking about? What does he have to do with magic? All of these things. So hopefully by the end of this episode, you will know, because today we are talking about Cyprianic grimoires and books of Saint Cyprian. And we have the only guest in my mind who I could talk to about this. My guest is a former experimental physicist currently studying magic in the records of the Portuguese Inquisition at the University of Coimbra. Holding not only a physics PhD since 2014, they also have a master's degree in religious studies with a major in Western esotericism from the University of Amsterdam, specializing in examining folk magic traditions in Portugal, as well as early modern and contemporary books of magic. They are the translator of the Book of Saint Cyprian, the Sorcerer's Treasure, and a myriad of Cyprianic texts collected in the work Opuscula Cypriani. I am beyond privileged to welcome to What Magic Is This? José Leitão. José, how are you?
I'm very well. I just had some rum. I'm very happy right now.
Amazing.
It's a very sunny afternoon over here.
Amazing.
Students are singing outside, so it's fine. Yes.
Is that something that happens quite a bit where you are?
Yes, it's September. It's Coimbra. Students are outside celebrating.
Oh, fantastic. Well, hopefully this will be some kind of a celebration in some way. It's the celebration of all things to do with Saint Cyprian. Now, I know that you get this question so often. In fact, I had it on a question form. You're like, I'm tired of talking about this. I'm tired of saying this story. But with a little bit of twisting of the arm, I would love to hear what you think of the story of Saint Cyprian. So who is Saint Cyprian and what is his story in a nutshell, if you could?
All right, okay. Saint Cyprian of Antioch, as distinct from Saint Cyprian of Carthage, is a fictional character from the 4th century. His name shows up in, I think, about 3 texts. The Conversion of Cyprian, the Confession of Cyprian, and the Martyrdom of Cyprian, sometimes collectively referred to as the Acts of Saint Cyprian of Antioch. And these are early Christian polemical texts whose purpose and objective is simply to underline the inherent superiority of Christianity as opposed to more traditional, at that time, pagan practices and beliefs. And they basically relate collectively. They relate the story of Cyprian, who was this pagan sorcerer, was born to pagan parents and was taken to be extraordinarily gifted from a young age. And his parents introduced him to various mystery cults and initiations and devoted him to various gods. And he grew in fame and knowledge and wisdom and all that, and eventually became a magician for hire. Now, the story, the text of Saint Cyprian of Antioch, the Acts, they're all, besides their objective as the text that they were written out to be, contemporarily, these texts are extremely interesting because whoever wrote them, this supposed Christian author who wanted to really highlight the superiority of Christianity, whoever wrote them was a rather informed individual. And actually, these texts can be mined for really a lot of information on Greek mystery cults. And even they seem to have a particular, I wouldn't say obsession, but a certain focus on the rise of Neoplatonism around Julian the Apostate.
Okay.
But anyway, that's the text. In the story, Cyprian becomes this magician for hire. Eventually, he is contacted by a young man. The name kind of varies a little bit depending on if you're reading Greek or Latin sources. Aglaïas, sometimes he is referred to, who had fallen in love with a Christian damsel, a local Antiochian Christian woman. And he was trying. He was well off, a well off individual. He was trying to marry her, but while her parents weren't opposed to the idea, this girl, referred to as either Justina or Justa, she wasn't having any of that. She wanted to dedicate herself to Christ. She was a Christian, and constantly refused Aglaïus. So his solution was just to hire Cyprian and try to have him do his magic and to just conquer this young woman. Cyprian started working on the matter, and the story gets a bit repetitive here because Cyprian starts just sending demons after Justina to tempt her and inflame her heart. And all the demons fail because she knew the sign of the cross, which banishes demons. Eventually, Cyprian summons the devil himself and asks for justification. What is happening? You are supposed to be the superior power in this. What's going on? And the devil confesses that, well, sure, that's all true, but this girl, she has the sign of the cross. That's out of my league. I can't do anything about that. And faced with this confession by the devil, Cyprian rebukes the devil. He rebukes his weakness and joins the Christian church as the superior power at play here. Now the story then converts, becomes. I don't know if he. I think they mentioned that he becomes a bishop eventually, and Justina becomes the head of a convent or something. But anyway, their fame grows, and eventually they are arrested as Christians. They try to firstly boil them in a cauldron of pitch and wax, and they throw Justina and Cyprian into this cauldron, and they are nothing happens. They are like invulnerable. There's a very interesting point here where there's another magician that shows up in the story at this point, a guy called Athanasius, who some stories claim that he was a former student of Cyprian, although I don't think the older ones mention this. I think this is more of a recent development. And he says, no, this has nothing to do with any Jesus or anything. No, this is Cyprian doing his magic. I know his magic. And he tries to also summon, I think, Apollo, and he throws himself into the cauldron and he dies. And then Justina and Cyprian are sent to Emperor Diocletian, and he doesn't play games; he just beheads them. So they die. There's also a Christian that was just randomly passing by at this point of the story and says hello to them, and he also is also killed.
Okay.
And all three are then buried, but then some Christians retrieve their bodies and supposedly send them to Rome. And that's basically it. That's the story of Saint Cyprian of Antioch. That's the three texts, the 4th century texts. Now, what becomes of the story after that? That's a whole other business, but that is the story as presented in the Acts of Saint Cyprian of Antioch.
Sure. I know we only got so much time, but how did the figure of Saint Cyprian and his story become so big that we're talking about him now, as opposed to, say, somebody like King Solomon, who is huge within the Western magical tradition? Cyprian's there. I mean, if you go a little bit further east in Europe, you have tales of Faust, but within Western magic, it's King Solomon and then followed up by Saint Cyprian. How did this happen since the 4th century?
Well, the evolution of the story or its reception. I mean, we have some points along history, but it's really not clear. And we know that there's a sermon by Gregory of Nazianzus, early church father, 4th century still. He does, in one of his sermons, he does mention Saint Cyprian of Antioch. So the story got disseminated, although he confuses him with Saint Cyprian of Carthage, which is something that will happen throughout history anyway. In the 4th and 5th century, we have a couple of mentions by a few poets. And in the 5th century, also we have that Empress Aelia Eudocia actually writes a poem about Saint Cyprian, just basically retelling the acts of Cyprian of Antioch. So we know that somehow this story got disseminated, and it seems that the figure of Saint Cyprian, the story, if you look at it, and if you look at it from a perspective of the reasoning, how people usually approach saints and they approach hagiographies, the logical outcome of a story such as this is placing Cyprian, firstly, as a martyr, which is a specific category within the pantheon of Catholicism. People don't realize that saints actually have categories, and there's a hierarchy between them, and a martyr is high up there. It places him as a martyr, and logically places him as a patron saint against magic, or a protection against magic. But along the way, for whatever reason, and I don't know how this happened, I don't think anyone has a satisfactory answer for this. Not only is Saint Cyprian taken to be a patron saint against magic, but he also acquires the position of being a patron saint in the aid of magic. Then, it's a big time lapse, but then in the 11th century, we already have Coptic sources mentioning the name of Saint Cyprian of Antioch as part of a love sorcery. So whatever happened, we know that he was talked about with some extent in up until the 5th century, and then 6 centuries later, he's already associated with magic.
Okay.
Now, what seems to really disseminate the story very widely is it's the inclusion of a version of the story of Saint Cyprian of Antioch in the Golden Legend, or the Flux Sanctor, which is this very popular collection of lives of the saints, which some authors have claimed it was actually more popular than the Bible, which isn't all that difficult to believe, because first of all, it was written in vernacular.
Right.
It was a very popular literary genre, not just a book, but a literary genre, Lives of the Saints. They were disseminated not only for commercial reasons, but the church found that these small stories of Lives of the Saints were actually a lot more useful in the Christianization and propagation of Christianity than the Bible, which is a complicated text independently of time frame. And the story of Saint Cyprian of Antioch gets really distributed all over Europe due to that. Now, if you're asking me why specific regions of Europe all of a sudden adopt Saint Cyprian as a magical hero and books start popping up associated with Saint Cyprian, that I cannot answer. I don't know. It just seems that certain populations really liked it.
Yeah.
I think it probably also has to do with because parallel to the story of Cyprian, you also have another text that shows up where nobody really knows where it comes from. The Prayer of Saint Cyprian, which is a very widely distributed magical religious text. It's a prayer, very lengthy one. It's usually perceived to have not only power as a verbal utterance, but also as a talismanic text, something that you can carry with you. And it also seems that the emergence of books attributed to Saint Cyprian have to do with that prayer, because that prayer will frequently feature in books of Saint Cyprian. So if you were to push me against the wall and force me to give you an answer, I would just say, well, probably in regions where the prayer of Saint Cyprian got popular, people started attaching things to it and made books of Saint Cyprian. This would happen eventually somewhere, and happen in a handful of places, and that's how we get the books. Again, pure supposition.
Yeah. I find it incredibly fascinating just how often the name Cyprian pops up in certain things. And even as far as what we're talking about specifically for this episode, things like a Thesaurus Spiritum, which is a kind of grimoire. And you have a text called De Negromancia, in which there's a mass of Saint Cyprian. I believe that's a 15th or 16th century English text. Cyprian made its way to the shores of England, and just we're not going to talk about how grimoires in Scandinavia, they're called I believe Cyprianus, and Black Book, Smart Book as. Let's concentrate more on for this episode, at least, on your specialty, which is Portugal and Iberia. So historically, how were witches and the culture of witchcraft different in Portugal than it was in the rest of Europe? I love this story. This is such an amazing thing. So, how is it different in Portugal?
All right, so that's a complicated question. It has several angles to it. So there are two major aspects there. One of them is that witchcraft as a practice, let's say, is something that is constructed throughout the early modern period, largely by intellectual elites. It's a gradual construction, a gradual collection of several elements from several sources. They have to do with certain ideas put forward by certain church fathers about the nature of what is the source of supernatural power in the world, which some will say, well, there is only one source of power in the world, that is God. Anything that is not godly and it somehow has power needs to be forcibly aligned with the devil, because if you're constructing a Christian cosmology, a framework, that's the only two sources of power that are theologically validated. And so that develops into the theory of the pact. And then all sorts of practices start to get attached to it, and all sorts of ideas and previous conceptions of non-Christian cults. Instead of being simply non-Christian, they start to be relegated to anti-Christian cults, and all gets clumped together and crystallized into this idea of witchcraft. And ironically, when you start having institutions like the Inquisitions popping up, this becomes a major tool that the Inquisitions have as basically just a framework to identify heresy. And ironically, it is the enforcement of the Inquisitions and this idea of a learned conception of witchcraft that actually ends up generating witchcraft, because the population gradually starts to assimilate those narratives, which are mostly alien to most regions in Europe, but they gradually become assimilated. Now, there is a distinction when we're now looking at Portugal, because the Inquisition was established here a bit later than some other regions like Spain. Actually, Spain is incorrect. Castile, which is the actual name of the kingdom.
Right.
It was institutionalized in 1536. And the primary preoccupation of the Inquisition was mostly Judaism and hidden Jews. So a few, for 1497, there was a forced conversion of Portuguese Jews to Christianity. It's the Alhambra Decree. King Manuel issued. It was part of his marriage deal with the Catholic monarchs. You can guess where that is going, because they are called the Catholic monarchs. As part of his marriage deal, that he needed to make his kingdom entirely Christian. So Jews and Muslims needed to find a way out. Muslims mostly, some converted, but mostly just went to North Africa, which is that much of a stretch. Jews also tried to leave, but it was a bit more complicated because they were the economic elites of the kingdom. And if King Manuel allowed them to simply leave, the kingdom would not. You would, like, your commercial force would just be destroyed. So he ended up basically prohibiting Jews from crossing the Portuguese border, which means he locked everybody in.
Oh.
And everybody was forced to convert to Christianity, to Catholicism, making a whole bunch of categories, which then become their own things, like Marranos and crypto Jews, hidden Jews, and all this. And when the Inquisition gets established in 1536 by King John III, the main preoccupation when it came to heresy, or when it came to non-Catholic stuff, was the notion that it was pretty prevalent in society that there are hidden Jews everywhere.
Yeah.
Which wasn't actually a lie, but they weren't bothering anybody.
No.
And so the Inquisition begins and is optimized and is almost solely focused on the persecution of hidden Jews. And they did that very efficiently. There are, we can talk about this at length, but anyway, that was their point. Their main concern when it came to harassing Portuguese society was hidden Jews. Let's find these Jews and let's take their money, because that's the other side, because they were still rich.
Right.
As a secondary preoccupation, there was also Protestantism, which never really had a particularly strong expression in Portugal. We do have small pockets, mostly associated with foreign traders or dignitaries. The king would issue some licenses. Okay, you're Protestants, but you're representative of a different crown. We have deals with this crown, so you get to hang around here. Just don't talk about your religion with anybody. And sometimes things happen. But then, on a tier very, very below that, below Judaism, below Protestantism, we had magical crimes. And just a comparison, look, 73% of all trials by the Lisbon Inquisition relate to Judaism. About magical crimes are like 3%.
3%, nothing.
Yeah. It's a few thousand trials. It's still a very decent number, but it's not something overwhelming. This basically, magic was a crime. It was a secular crime and it was a religious crime. So if somebody was found practicing magic of whatever sort, he could be tried in a secular tribunal or the Inquisition. There was a period of time where the bishops could also try them, the episcopal courts, which is always a big mess when you have three tribunals with distinct legal frameworks that all want to persecute the same people. But it was mostly the secular and the inquisitional courts. And if somebody got found, they would be tried, and they would be arrested and tried. But nobody was out there looking for them. There was no process. There was no historical movement that might be referred to as a witch hunt.
Right.
Because the Inquisition wasn't actually interested in them. There were Jew hunters. You had plenty of those, but witch hunters, not really.
Yeah.
And also, and these are fine theological points. The dominant theological conceptions in the Portuguese kingdom that the Inquisition really pushed forward were mostly based on Thomas Aquinas, and he doesn't place too much emphasis on the power of witches and the devil. He's a bit skeptical about it. He's not denying that the devil has power, but let's take it easy. And so the very inquisitors weren't always that much of believers in the reality of magic, in the reality of witchcraft, particularly witchcraft. They didn't really care too much about it. So during most of the period, this enforcement of the witchcraft narrative didn't get imposed on the population all that hard, because they didn't even have the resources to do that. They simply, if magic gets fined, sure, we'll try them, we'll call him a heretic, maybe we'll slap a pact on him, but it's not a big deal. And the penalties were very light compared to other regions. We had a handful of witch burnings, really a handful. And when those happened, most people were horrified. And so it was bad publicity. The Inquisition didn't really like that. They like burning Jews, but which is only if something really serious would have happened would you burn a witch. Most often you would just light penalties, maybe a fine, maybe banish them to Brazil or something like that. And now as time moves on, when you enter into the 18th century, this is the only time period when you start to have more formally conceived witchcraft trials, because it is only in the 18th century, which is rather late compared to the rest of Europe, that the population actually starts to appropriate the narratives of witchcraft.
Okay.
They've been around long enough that people start to integrate those into their own beliefs. But even still, frequently, when the inquisitors found anyone which they could project witchcraft upon, or who would themselves start to talk about things identifiable as learned witchcraft, frequently the narratives that these people told were extremely heterogeneous. So they still possessed a lot of local elements, more relegated to folklore and folk magic, that really didn't fit entirely the mold of learned witchcraft, which frequently results in frustration by the inquisitors that they really can't pin this one down as witchcraft. They say, yeah, it's the devil, but we can't pin everything on this guy. And so yeah, that was basically how witchcraft was working. Now, obviously, there's another aspect to witchcraft. I think Richard Kirchhofer mentions this, that there are always two distinctions among witchcraft. You have this learned witchcraft, which is what I'm talking about, but then you have a folk concept of witchcraft, which is as variable as there are cultures in the world. There will be a category, a social category in small rural communities, which you might call witch, or that they there will call witch, but their conception of what a witch is entirely distinct than what a theologian will think a witch is. The most rapid, easy distinction between these is that from a theological perspective, a witch does not have intrinsic power. The power is given externally to them by the virtue of their pact. It's a demon or it's a devil that enacts the supernatural abilities and not the witch itself. From a folk perspective, witches have inherent power, and they're usually associated with instances of remarkable birth. So we do have those in Portugal, bruxas, which are, again, it's a social category, and it serves a social function, but they are mostly, it's a folkloric concept.
Right.
So the issue of witchcraft, if this is what you're talking about, is that there is a folkloric issue here, but the enforcement of the learned witchcraft theory was very weak here. And so we have all these other forms of magical practice happening, but happening autonomously outside of these forced theological projections.
Fantastic. Such an interesting historical period of time for sure, certainly. Thank you so much for putting that as clear as you did. That's amazing, José. I'm going to ask this right now before we start talking about the books themselves. And it's a personal question. José does such incredible work. He's going through inquisitional records, just thousands of these things to mine them. And so this takes a lot of effort and a lot of work, José. So why is the Book of Saint Cyprian and why are Portuguese Cyprianic grimoires, why are they so fascinating to you? Why have you dedicated such an enormous part of your life to looking at these texts?
That's an issue of personal history. I probably don't have a good rational reason for that. I come from a low middle class, run of the mill Portuguese family. My grandmother was fairly an attentive Catholic. My parents were what you call what here we call non-practicing Catholics, which is a concept that it's basically they're culturally Catholic, just the same way that you have in secular societies. You have cultural Jews, you have cultural Muslims. People who just go with the motions, but their beliefs aren't really there, but they respect the culture. So they were culturally Catholic, and I heard about the Book of Saint Cyprian. I don't know, primary school or something like that. I think my brother mentioned it. He was doing some work in school with his colleagues, and he went to the library, and there was this Book of Saint Cyprian there, and everybody was horrified. And then they told me about it, and I was horrified for them. And my grandmother also chipped in and said, "Oh, that's evil. That's the devil right there. Don't touch that book. That book it'll mess you up." And then you start talking with other people, and everybody had like an urban myth about the Book of Saint Cyprian back then. If you read the book, like fully, first of all, you if you start reading the book, you can't stop. I was never told why. I don't know if it was like an obsession, like a Lovecraftian thing,
Right.
or if you just died. I don't know. You can't stop, and when you finish it, then the devil shows up, and all sorts of things.
Yeah.
So look, and I wasn't. I was a good boy. I didn't touch it. But just eventually, you grow up, you become interested in whatever it is that you're interested in. I started getting interested in, first of all, history, which is always good. And then particularly in college, started getting interested in esotericism and certain forms of magic. Back in those days, particularly in Portugal, there is still somewhat limited access to magic literature over here. We do have a few publishers now, but they mostly just publish the popular stuff. If you want really some interesting thing out of the box kind of stuff like grimoires, it's still kind of hard to find. But I was looking into magic, your thelemic chaos magic sort of thing, which is always very attractive to adolescent boys. Um, but then eventually, I honestly got bored with that. Crowley is a very seductive author, but he is very, because he has an answer for everything. Everything fits the lema. But at a certain point, I got tired of all the Egyptian stuff. I don't like Egypt. I'm a bad esotericist. Everybody's supposed to love Egypt. I can't stand it.
Okay.
And I got tired of the Egyptian names and fuck this guy. So I started looking for something else, and it was about that time that Scarlet Imprint came out with Howlings. Still one of my favorite books ever published of the contemporary magic revival. Howlings and Diabolical, beautiful books.
Absolutely.
And I read those, and it was like a breath of fresh air. Just some people I never heard about talking about books I never heard about. Beautiful, beautiful publications. And then I remember the Book of Saint Cyprian, that there is something here akin to this that I heard about once upon a time. Let me look into that. And I eventually did. It took me a while because I was really broke back then, and books of Saint Cyprian aren't that expensive, but it does cost money. And when you don't have any money, a lot of money or little money is still money. So it took me a while to find the Book of Saint Cyprian, and then I did. Around that time, Jake Stratton Kent was already, I think he already published his translation of the
True Grimoire?
The Baron. And he had a section in there about the books of Saint Cyprian, which was, he's talking about us. And the way that he went about his book really got me thinking that something like that could be done about the Book of Saint Cyprian. And eventually I just ended up doing it. For a while I did rationalize it that there's probably better people than me to do this. But I guess at some point I got tired of waiting and said, okay, fuck it, I'm going to write this myself. I have found out as a writer that you end up writing the books you wish you could have read when you were young, so I decided to write it. And I don't know, it clicked to me. I'm not, I can defend my original translation of the Book of Saint Cyprian as I published in 2014. I will put a little asterisk in saying some of the comments might not be historically accurate anymore because it was a long time ago.
Yeah.
But I did my best, and it clicked. Somehow it felt right at home. I'm not saying it was easy. It was a struggle still. There are cultural issues you have to deal with. But it was, like I said, felt right. Felt like something I could do, and I've kept doing it. I've tried my best to always go at it from angles that seemed right and fair and academically informed, which ultimately is what I won't say forced me, but really informed my decision to maybe stop being a physicist, because I was very bored there.
Yeah.
It was a good job. As a 9-to-5 job, it was very good because it paid a lot and it wasn't unpleasant. But overall, it was still quite boring to me. And this informed my decision to eventually just take a second master's degree in history and esotericism and just see how far I can take this and provide proper, informed translations and understandings of this line of literature.
Fantastic. And all of us owe you a huge debt of gratitude if this stuff is interesting, because You do the work. You really do. And Jose has a wonderful YouTube account, and you can watch some of the videos there in which he has the records of all of these inquisitional papers, and they're really quite fascinating. And that takes a ton of work. I have to say, how far back can we say that something called a Book of Saint Cyprian was being used?
Right. From the records of the Portuguese Inquisition, there is a date. And for a long time, I thought this date was the oldest I could find. No, I'm just going to put an asterisk in there. This is based on the Inquisition,
Yeah.
which is the database I'm specialized in because it was the one I thought, and I think rightly so. If I want to study magic, this is where I'm going to find a more abundant number of sources. And let me just underline the full extent of the Portuguese Inquisition. While the magic trials are fairly rare comparatively to the Judaism trials, it is a near inexhaustible source of information because it's not only the words that are written there. It's every single word implies context, implies ideas, spirit heart. It's you can look at this massive resource of information from so many different angles, and you can extract so much information from there. Just that is nearly inexhaustible. And if I manage to have an academic career, I will not exhaust this. So, first of all, there's room for everybody. So, if anybody wants to help me out, so it's
nice recruitment.
Anyway, the Portuguese Inquisition and referring to references to Book of Saint Cyprian there. For the longest time, I thought that the oldest reference to a Book of Saint Cyprian was 1620, the trial of a guy called Pedro Afonso. Pedro Afonso, we can go into his trial in more detail a bit later, but Pedro Afonso mentions in his trial, and he was an old dude, he was like 70 when they got him. He mentions that the book he had, which is explicitly mentioned as a Book of Saint Cyprian, had been produced 30 years before, meaning 1590, so end of the 16th century, and it was copied from another book. So there was an older book. So I'm gonna the spitballing. This is the rough period when books of Saint Cyprian start to appear. I'm gonna say late 16th century. This is as far as we can push them. Now, having said that, more recently I did become aware of another document, not Portuguese Inquisition, Spanish Inquisition. For the longest time, I thought the Portuguese Cyprian books were the oldest, but maybe not so. I didn't discover this document. This document had been discovered. Somebody just called my attention to it more recently. The great researcher, the Galician researcher, Felix Castro Vicente, who is a precursor to everybody contemporarily looking at books of Saint Cyprian. And he mentions that there is a denunciation. It's not really a process, a trial. It's a denunciation against a guy called Juan de Toledo, a Spanish guy in Toledo, from the Toledo Inquisition, who is mentioned as having an object referred to as a Libro de San Cipriano, which is basically the Spanish for Book of Saint Cyprian, in 1610, so 10 years before Pedro Afonso. So the reference Pedro Afonso makes that his book was produced 30 years before his trial is still the oldest date, but the earliest document is 1610 Toledo Inquisition.
Nice. As far as things that we have, concrete things that we can look at as far as documents are concerned, how far back do we go for an actual document that is stashed away at an archive that we can point to and say that is a Book of Saint Cyprian?
Look, there is also a matter of debate there, because there needs to be a definition of what constitutes a Book of Saint Cyprian.
Okay.
And we, at this point, it's hard when we just have two examples, the 1610, 1620, and we don't have those books.
No.
They are referred to as books of Saint Cyprian. We don't know what is causing this name to be attributed to them. Did the book have the title written on it, or was this some kind of cultural projection that a book shows up, it has certain characteristics, and these characteristics identify it as a Book of Saint Cyprian? We don't know this. we can make certain suppositions that, like I said before, I assume that early on a Book of Saint Cyprian would be something that would be collected around a prayer of Saint Cyprian.
Okay.
This is my working definition. We don't know anything about the Juan de Toledo book. It's just a small denunciation. There is no description of content. We do have the description of the content of the Pedro Afonso book, which does contain a prayer of Saint Cyprian as an extremely relevant section of that book. It basically, the prayer of Saint Cyprian is believed to have certain characteristics, talismanic characteristics, and those same characteristics are given to his book, which suggests that there was this, let's say, quote, air quotes, a contamination from the characteristics of the prayer to the whole book. And it was this prayer that was giving the title, Prayer of Saint Cyprian. Now, having said that, that means that every time we find a prayer of Saint Cyprian in the 15th, 16th, 17th century, 18th century, anytime we find a prayer of Saint Cyprian, this is a potential instance of a book of Saint Cyprian, depending on its material characteristics or if it has other stuff attached to it.
Yeah.
With that in mind, there are some manuscripts that are mentioned in Inquisition trials that kind of fit that definition. But again, these are mostly descriptions of them. There seems to be a reframing of books of Saint Cyprian in the 18th century. Magic follows fashion. 19th century people like to say that magic is like the perennial tradition and it exists continuously from it. No, it doesn't. It follows fashion.
Yeah.
In the 18th century, books of Saint Cyprian get largely reframed as treasure hunting books.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going somewhere with this, I promise. Treasure hunting books. And I believe that the reason why books of Saint Cyprian become treasure hunting books is again because of the prayer of Saint Cyprian, which is a method to, in the 16th century and 17th century, it's a method to banish evil spirits. You read the prayer and you banish a spirit. And treasure hunting is frequently, this is nearly universal, the concept of treasure hunting, that a buried treasure will frequently have a treasure guardian, a spirit of some kind. And it seems that the prayer of Saint Cyprian started being used by treasure hunters in the 18th century as a method to banish this spirit. So books of Saint Cyprian become heavily associated with treasure hunting. And the first book of Saint Cyprian that we can, first manuscript that we can point at and say, that book over there fills every requirement to be called the Book of Saint Cyprian, is a treasure hunting book. Currently housed in the manuscript section of the library of the University of Coimbra, where I am speaking to you from.
Cool.
It doesn't have a title. It's just it starts off. It's one book, like 30 folios long, not very big. It contains one single ritual. The ritual is largely a repetitive recitation of the prayer of Saint Cyprian, and then you have some instructions to use some rhabdomancy and how to make a couple of circles and stuff like that. But it is, on all accounts, a book specialized in treasure hunting that basically uses the prayer of Saint Cyprian to banish treasure, which, if you look at the Inquisition trials from the 18th century, qualifies it as a book of Saint Cyprian. So this is a book of Saint Cyprian as far as I can tell.
Yeah.
Now that was, until very recently, the only manuscript example of a book of Saint Cyprian we found. And I already published this a few different times. It's present. I published it in the book you mentioned before, the Opuscula Cypriani. And I also published it as a standalone small book as the Coimbra Book of Saint Cyprian.
Right.
So if anybody who's interested can look at it. It's a very interesting historical document. Very useful if you're interested in finding treasure. So, that's up to you. But again, recently, last year or something, once again, the great researcher and gentleman, Felix Castro Vicente, that same Galician individual, he has managed to locate a second manuscript book of Saint Cyprian.
Okay.
Yeah. Very, very exciting. He found it, I think it's in private hands. He did take photos of the whole thing. Nice. He showed me the photos. It is not my place to talk extensively about this. It's his work. He should be the one to discuss it. I can say that it is, again, seems to be 18th century. Without careful examination, I cannot say which one is older, the Coimbra book or his book. Written in Latin, which is a bit rarer.
Yeah.
The Coimbra book is written in vernacular, in Portuguese. And it's a lot more visually impressive than the Coimbra book. The Coimbra book is just text. That one has beautiful circles, beautiful like stuff. It's really exciting. So those are the two older books. We don't know which one is older yet, at least. We can do that by various methods. One, just usually the paper manufacturer will have a sign, and you can usually date the paper. So that's one way to go about it. But we don't know which one is older. But that is currently available to the public. It's the Coimbra book, which is right here in Coimbra.
Nice. I think a lot of people, when we try to think about grimoires, we always think that they're these old, ancient, they're from the 5th century and things like that. A lot of times these are far more modern than people realize. And it's very, very fascinating. We got to switch gears here. In your 2014 book, the Book of Saint Cyprian, The Sorcerer's Treasure, the introduction to that, you talk about how there are two major distinct versions of books of Saint Cyprian. Are you able to take the listeners through these two distinct categories and the major differences between the two?
Okay. I'm assuming probably if I remember myself from 2014, probably I was talking about contemporary books,
right? Yes,
the books available right now.
Yeah.
So right now, in Iberia, you have two main lines of books. You have one book that's mostly dominant in Portugal, and you have one that's mostly dominant in Spain. One I usually refer to as the Sorcerer's Treasure, because if you just look at the title, if you translate both of them to English, it's the Book of Saint Cyprian.
Right.
The Portuguese one usually tends to be a little more grandeur about it. He likes to call itself the Grand Book of Saint Cyprian, or the Great Book of Saint Cyprian, and the Sorcerer's Treasure. Yeah. That one's just the Book of Saint Cyprian. Sometimes it also has the subtitle The Sorcerer's Treasure, which makes it very complicated. But anyway, you have those two versions, and the content is fairly distinct. They do have common points. So whatever their origins, at some point they did communicate. So they aren't isolated from each other. Particularly, they have a few common, like small sorceries, like for your mundane preoccupations. But overall, the version that's dominant in Portugal, it's a very extensive, long book, contains like 3 parts. The organization is really at times odd. There are sections that you would assume somebody would have just put these together and save space. There's actually repetition of content in it. It seems to follow, from my understanding of the history of the books of Saint Cyprian, seems to follow that tradition a lot closer. Namely that the first part of the book, which I consider the most interesting part, contains an extensive ritual to banish spirits, which has as its base the prayer of Saint Cyprian, so that makes historical sense. Besides this, it also contains a very extensive treasure hunting ritual that again uses the prayer of Saint Cyprian, so makes historical sense. And then it has these collections of folk remedies, and particularly the later sections have like whole block quotes from obscure, erudite Portuguese sources, fictionalists like from a guy called what's his name? Jesus, forgot his name. Anyway, it's a Baroque author that's kind of popular in Portugal. But then you also have a guy that was basically, he just wrote jokes.
Okay.
And he wrote this joking history of the city of Évora, which is a city in the south of Portugal, rather at the time a rather relevant city, not so much anymore, although it's still beautiful. But he wrote this joke history of the city of Évora, full of outlandish stories of magic and witchcraft and this and that. And there's a whole section of this book present in the Book of Saint Cyprian for no apparent reason.
It's just there.
It's just there. So it has these weird elements. Yeah. But the beginning of the book is historically consistent to what I understand of the history of the Book of Saint Cyprian. Now, the Spanish version is usually very distinct. It has a very characteristic opening, which the book is attributed to a German monk called Jonas Sulfuri Jonas.
Sulfuri Jones.
From the broken mountain that he received the Book of Saint Cyprian from the devil or some shit like that.
Yeah.
Really strange narrative. So I usually refer to as a shorthand reference. I call this the Sulfurino book. Just everybody knows. If you're into books of Saint Cyprian, you know what that means.
Yeah.
And like I said, it contains some elements similar to the Portuguese book, but then it really breaks away with the historical development of it, particularly when it comes to treasure hunting.
Right.
Because while the Book of Saint Cyprian still relies on the prayer of Saint Cyprian to do its treasure hunting stuff, this one largely reuses material from the Grand Grimoire, which is an early 18th century French and Italian grimoire that does have a significant presence in magic practice in the 18th century in Spain. And at the end of the 18th century, early 19th century, this is stuff I'm working on right now, it also has a very significant presence in Portugal. But it does have a significant presence in Spain, and material from that gets incorporated into the books of St. Cyprian somehow. And the treasure hunting section of that book seems to rely basically on the Grand Grimoire methodologies of basically summoning the Prime Minister of Hell, Lucifuge Hofocale, who has the stewardship of all buried treasure. Right. It largely forgoes the use of the prayer of Saint Cyprian, which is interesting. I'm not going to say it's an inferior book because there is no such thing. Because if you start from the beginning and Saint Cyprian is a fictional character, so what is true? It's all valid.
Yeah.
It's very so. It has elements from other grimoires. It has elements from the Key of Solomon. The more extended versions also have elements from the Black Pullet, and and this book also generates a few offshoots, and the largest of them also has that material from the Grand de Petit Albert. So
yeah,
it's more of a collection of let's say European magic clumped together with some Cyprian material, which makes a very interesting book nonetheless.
Yeah,
but yeah, those are the two main versions.
For folks that are living in, say, like America, if you were to go into like a bodega or a place that's owned and run usually by people from Mexico, most likely if you find El Libro de San Cipriano in one of these bodegas, most likely it's going to be one of these Sulfurino books of Saint Cyprian. People like exactly. It's the version that I got when I went down to Mexico. I used to spend a lot of time in Mexico. Whenever you go there, they're going to have this book, and so it's very distinct from the Portuguese Book of Saint Cyprian. So just something to keep in mind. And perhaps if you go to places where there's a larger Brazilian population, you might find, although it might be a little bit harder because the Brazilian Ciprianos are an entirely different beast as well. So there's a lot.
They really ran with it.
Yeah, they really did. Usually the covers to the Brazilian books of Saint Cyprian are like, they're pretty hardcore. The ones for the Spanish Sulfurino ones, they're pretty cartoonish, but the Brazilian ones, man, they go full out. So for those who may be unfamiliar with books of Saint Cyprian, let's hone down a little bit more on the Portuguese Book of Saint Cyprian. What sort of spells and rituals are usually to be found in this particular Book of Saint Cyprian?
Well, first, like I said, the what I consider the main section of the book has an extended exorcism using the prayer of Saint Cyprian, and you have the treasure hunting stuff.
Yeah.
So on top of this, you also have a whole bunch of divination,
right? Yeah,
astrology, cartomancy. Cartomancy is very relevant in the Cyprian books, and this also has historical reasons. During the 16th and 17th century, that's 17th century is more accurate. There's a great deal of divination in urban centers, some forms of which are very much attributed to Saint Cyprian. This is a form of urban folk magic. Its divination is usually associated with Saint Cyprian in this form of magic, and it seems to continue into the book. So you have cartomancy as particularly associated from the 19th century onward with Saint Cyprian, so that's heavily present in these books. Then, like I said, you have these near nonsensical blocks from erudite Portuguese sources that it's anyone's guess what they're doing there. But besides that, you have several collections of small sorceries, small procedures, small recipes, small this, and that, most of which tend to circle around fairly mundane preoccupations, some of them associated with a certain stereotypical world of urban female preoccupation. Let's say, how do I get a man? How do I get rid of a man? How do I keep a man? That sort of thing. And others are a bit more interesting. There are a couple of small sorceries, like how to speak with souls in purgatory. Um, these small procedures that wouldn't be out of place in an ethnographic collection of folk magic or folk superstition. Just these tiny things, a couple of paragraphs. So if you want this, do this, and that. Use this liquid, use that herb, burn this incense. It's really small sort of things that it's meant for I guess everyday life. It's not technically it's learned magic, because once you write anything down, it becomes a learned object because you need to know how to read. But the preoccupations are pretty much the same as folk magic, which is pragmatism. It's I need money, I need health, I need sex. That's typically what it goes about.
The age old thing that magic has always been used for, getting paid and getting
Yes.
laid. It's just that's where we're standing. Very cool. I don't want you to give away absolutely everything because it's a fascinating text and I want people to run out and find it. But there's a Cyprianic divination that you wrote a book on called Clearing the Waters. Are you able to give people a short summary of this fascinating divination process that you found?
Sure. Well, that book was a direct. I didn't set out to research this. I just kind of stumbled upon it. Like I said, in the Book of Saint Cyprian, the one I translated, there are a few sections of cartomancy.
Yeah,
and they are particular. They're slightly, something doesn't make sense about them. So
okay,
they're very simple. They're not this elaborate esoteric tarot. They're quite simple. It's you grab a deck. The court cards symbolize people. The other cards symbolize events and locations and moments and stuff. And then you do this spread, and then you construct a narrative based on all that. So the people that the court cards represent, they are doing things in accordance to the cards that are next to them. So it's really simple.
yeah,
But there was associated with one of these cartomancy systems, there was a specific incantation that you were supposed to say if a certain combination of cards shows up. It's something that's you have to, you don't always have to do, but if something happens, you need to pray this. And it's this really strange incantation referring to a supposed seafaring journey that Saint Cyprian did at some point in his life, that somehow this has to do with divination. And that never sat well with me. It didn't sit well with Jake Stratton Kent either. He has a whole essay on Cyprian Old World about it, because he was also quite confused by it. So this never sat well with me. But then when I started doing my current research into the magic in the Portuguese Inquisition for my thesis, I started finding these incantations completely that were very similar to this. The bunch of incantations talking about Saint Cyprian and saying that he took a sea journey and found his lots and was something about divination, all these things. So I started paying attention to this, that there was you had this incantation in the 19th century book, but then you were finding the same incantation in the 17th century. So 200 years of difference, the same incantation, usually that's a red flag for something. Not sure what, but there is something here. There is a continuity here from these divination procedures I'm finding among urban dwelling illiterate individuals, mostly women. There is a continuity between whatever is happening here and this printed book in the 19th century. So I'm going to try to figure this out.
right.
So I collected a whole bunch of them, really a lot of instances of these incantations and the procedures behind them. And these incantations were used for hydromancy, which is divination using water. It was basically, there are, obviously this is a form of folk magic, so there are variations of the procedure, but you would basically grab usually a chamber pot. Chamber pots are really stressed. Some people use glass bowls, but they weren't the indicated one. It needs to be a chamber pot. You would fill it with water, and then you would most frequently cast some straws into this, and the straws would be referred to as the lots. And the incantation goes, Saint Cyprian, 7 years the sea though roamed, 7 lots you cast into the sea, and then you took them out. Which, when you're talking about cards, doesn't make a lick of sense. But then you read the original hydromancy, and the straws are the lots, so the incantation makes thematical sense with the procedure being done. And then you needed frequently a specialized seer, usually needed to be a virgin girl. And you could also cast other things into the bowl, but the straws were typically the more common ones. And then the seer would look at the bowl and supposedly have a vision.
Okay.
Now, this system of divination was not the most popular in this particular time period among this particular social group, because it seemed to be specialized on seafaring travelers, which obviously makes sense. In the 16th century, 17th century Portugal, we had a fairly extensive empire. Men were constantly being drafted into boats. And so this is a female type of divination. It was mostly widows or people who were being separated by their husbands, just trying to figure out if they were alive.
Yeah.
Not for romantic purposes, because if they were dead, they needed to find a new man.
Right. Right.
For survivability, it's about money.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, you don't want to be a widow.
Right.
So I found this. But as I was researching this, I also found another divination technique, which was favomancy, or the lots of the favos. Now, favomancy isn't exclusively Portuguese. You have various forms of favomancy, but this one was particular. And this was probably the more popular version of divination. This was widespread. And this basically had that you would collect a number of fava beans, and there's a whole procedure around this. You have to baptize them, and they all need to be distinct from each other. You need to be able to tell the favas apart. You need to baptize them and give them names and a whole bunch of things. And then when you want to do the divination, you grab the favas, or the appropriate number of favas to represent the individuals who you want to divine about. And then you mix this with a whole bunch of other objects, small trinkets like pieces of coins, or pieces of stones, or pieces of wood. And you mix all of these. And then you cast these over a surface. And then you have several arrangements of objects, and looking at the relative position of different favas with the different objects, you basically construct a story of the individuals the fava represent and the things that the objects represent. This was a complete parallel to the cartomancy system present in the 19th century book, but instead of favas, you have the court cards, and instead of the objects, you have the pip cards.
Right.
So I don't know exactly how this happened, because this is ongoing research, although I already published a book on it, because I was so excited about it. So the 18th century is still unclear to me, but somehow what seems to have been the case is that these two systems of early modern divination, 17th century divination, the hydromancy with its Saint Cyprian incantation, and the favomancy with its general methodology of constructing a story, somehow in the 18th century gets clumped together around cartomancy. The incantation from one system of divination gets attributed to cartomancy, and general methodology from the favomancy gets attributed to cartomancy, and these two things mix. And they get published in the 19th century as a cartomancy system.
Yeah.
And basically that book is just evidencing that, trying to track it and making sense of basically resolving this mystery of why is a seafaring incantation associated with cartomancy.
Yeah.
That the book is just trying to solve that by identifying these other older systems of divination and how they might have come together.
Fascinating. Yeah, that's incredible. I want to put you on the spot, José.
All right.
What's your favorite or the most unusual thing you've come across in one particular Book of Saint Cyprian? Because they do get pretty wild. Is there something that you're just like, man, that is really cool, or that is so bizarre? What's the one that really, without even thinking about it, what's the first thing that comes up to you?
Oh, I have one. This one I found during my PhD. It's not published yet.
Okay.
I found one, which is a Saint Cyprian book that has instructions on how to make a pact with Lucifer Focale.
Okay.
From a non-Solomonic perspective. So it explicitly denies divine magic, says Solomon and Noah and Adam, they're all fools. I know a lot better, and in order to do actual magic, you need to do a pact. And it's such a wild book. It's antagonistic to everything that I thought I knew about Saint Cyprian books.
Okay.
It's a curveball. It's a real curveball, and it's such a cool, like, it is a small text, so you can read it in one sitting and be bewildered by it. Yeah. It's such a cool small text, and it's specialized in finding Moorish treasure, which is a very local Portuguese folkloric concept. So it's a book of Saint Cyprian that invokes Lucifuge to find folkloric treasure, and then it has instructions on how to make this complex mechanism of rotating parts of different woods that somehow point to treasure, and then it says, fuck Noah and I know better. It's such a wild, weird text, and I'm still fascinated by it.
Yeah.
That's going to be one of my future publications, hopefully.
Oh man, really looking. Is it in some way related at all? I mean, because Lucifuge is there, is to the Grand Grimoire, or does it kind of just take the name and then throw everything else out?
It needs to be somehow.
Yeah.
Because the interesting part is that, like I said, the Spanish Cyprian books do call on Lucifuge, but they use the methodology of the Grand Grimoire, which is a Solomonic derivative.
Right.
These, it's Lucifuge, and I'm not going to use the Grand Grimoire methodology. I'm going to use something else.
Right.
Yeah.
Incredible. Oh man, I can't wait for that. That should be so fascinating. Let's hang on this idea of treasure. So when somebody is familiar with something like the Clavicula or a Key of Solomon, there might be, in some of the iterations, there might be a spell or two about finding treasure. But when one takes a look at the Portuguese Cyprianic grimoires, they will notice that treasure finding and hunting is a huge aim of the book, as you've mentioned. Not so much about how they go about it. Why was treasure hunting such a big deal in the Cyprian material in Portugal?
Well, the easy answer for that is just, that, and it's a cop-out, historical circumstance.
Yeah.
Look, I've touched upon this. You have this method of banishing spirits that is very popular in the Iberian Peninsula, the prayer of Saint Cyprian. It's really popular. Like, I think I've lost count of how many prayers of Saint Cyprian I found in the Inquisition. Just the records, just attached to the trials. The 18th century spells a number of novelties in magic practice and new fashions, and this is in all of Europe and America too. Treasure hunting becomes increasingly popular in the 18th century all over the place. And you do have books popping up that specialize in this. Again, the Grand Grimoire is one example of those internationally. Treasure hunting becomes also a thing in the Iberian Peninsula, and we already had some previous. I'm not saying we're special about it. Everybody has particular concepts of local treasure. Usually these concepts tend to be folkloric in nature or cultural specific. They're contextual. In Portugal, we had this very, very dense web of narratives about buried treasure. Basically, when we're talking about buried treasure in the Iberian Peninsula, it's usually referred to as Moorish or Mouro treasure. Basically, it's associated with narratives of the Reconquista, which is the historical moment when the Iberian Peninsula was reconquered by Christian kingdoms from their Muslim occupants. So the Iberian Peninsula got conquered in the 8th century by a Muslim force entering through North Africa. It wasn't so much of a conquest as a simple change of administration.
Okay, yeah.
The idea of conquest is wrong. Because they conquered the Iberian Peninsula like 2 years or something. You can't conquer a territory like that. It took the Romans 200.
Right.
They just walked in because people didn't care.
Right. There's other things to do. There are the fields. There's things to grow. Yeah.
So eventually, there's the Reconquista, the process which there were a few Christian enclaves in northern Iberia, and then they start reconquering territory. And the stories about this are highly idealistic. They are meant to like the legends and the folk stories. They are meant to underline the specialness and the usness of Christianity. And they basically say that, well, as the Christian armies were advancing on Muslim territory, some individual Muslims, they would bury their treasure before escaping, in the hopes that perhaps in the future they would be able to return to dig it back. And this actually isn't a preposterous thing. People have done that in the past frequently.
Yeah.
Actually, an interesting story. This happened in the Napoleonic invasions in Portugal. That there was a whole village that buried their wine in the graveyard, and when they came back, the wine was excellent. So now they have their own category of wine where they bury it. So this happened.
Amazing. Well, that's that is so cool. Oh man, I want some. I mean, who doesn't? But I don't
it's called the wine of the dead.
Oh man, that's necromantically delicious.
Yeah.
Tasty.
So this is stuff that happens. So people were saying, okay, so as the Christian armies were advancing, Muslims were retreating, certain individuals would bury their riches. And then you get into the more fantastical elements. And they say, well, obviously Muslims, they were great sorcerers. And so they would frequently place this enchantment, an encanto, over their treasure. And not only that, they would sometimes also place an enchantment over like an individual, usually a girl, and making her a mora encantada, or an enchanted Moor, to act as a treasure guardian.
Mm-hmm.
The encanto is a complex concept, and you have also iterations of this in South America. If nothing else, I think there's a movie called Encanto.
Yes, sir.
I think so. Like I don't know, it's a Pixar movie. I don't follow those. The Encanto is a complex concept. Usually, individuals under an Encanto, they're like in this suspended state of animation. They're not dead or alive, and they can manifest within certain limits. Particularly if you try to mess with their treasure, they will manifest frequently in monstrous forms, like giant serpents and giant lizards. And so these stories. There are hundreds or thousands of them throughout the Iberian Peninsula. These buried Muslim treasures, this Moor treasure. And the books of when treasure hunting becomes popular, these are the treasures that people are thinking about. So it's not solely the physical money being buried; it's more of a local religious cosmological thing. So books of Saint Cyprian get brought in as a method to banish these guardians using the prayer of Saint Cyprian. Now I've done a small survey of mentions of books of Saint Cyprian in the 18th century. So far, I've found 7, I think, which is significant.
Yeah.
7 mentions, but these are a lot more individuals than 7, because frequently treasure hunters tended to act in groups. So you can have one of these 7 can have like 10 individuals involved. But I can't say that the survey is complete, because I need to have access to some documentation, which is really hard to access. But anyway, I have 7 instances of books of Saint Cyprian, 6 of which refer to treasure hunting. So it seems to have become the major identifier of what makes a book of Saint Cyprian in that period. And not only this, but you also have mentions by, or rather, there's another weird case, an Inquisition trial of one of these groups where they keep talking about the Book of Saint Cyprian.
Okay.
We're going to go find treasure. We're going to use this Book of Saint Cyprian. We're going to do this and you're going to do that. But when they describe sections of this book, it's clear that the book they have is a Grand Grimoire.
Okay.
So it seems that the association with books of Saint Cyprian and treasure hunting became so strict that books of treasure hunting in Portugal simply got referred to as books of Saint Cyprian. That became the identifier. It was not so much, do these have the prayer of Saint Cyprian? Is it the treasure hunting book? Yes. Then it's probably a book of Saint Cyprian. This becomes the identifier. And it stuck. So when you get to the 19th century, whoever composed the Portuguese book, you can say that he was historically informed. He simply followed what was the book at that point, which was a treasure hunting book.
Yeah.
And so this always features preeminently in Cyprian literature.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for taking us through that. Yeah, it's when one first gets, if somebody's familiar with grimoires, most European grimoires, as I said, there's not a ton of stuff about treasure in there. It's there. It's always there. But then when I first got a copy of your translation of The Sorcerer's Treasure, it's just page after page of finding treasure. And it's still fascinating, but it's like, I was not expecting that. No, it's an incredible thing. I'm going to share a little bit of a personal story. When I was first dating my current girlfriend, I had books lying about. Of course, one of them happened to be Book of Saint Cyprian. And I watched her. She was sitting on my couch and she was just flipping through it. And she was there for about an hour or so. And of all of the things that should draw her attention, she said to me, Doug, what's with all these stories of Saint Cyprian falling in love with a girl and then like murdering their family? And what's with this horny, randy stories of Saint Cyprian in these books of Saint Cyprian? Why are they there? I think there's like names like Elvira and Adelaide, or I might get that wrong, but like what it's kind of jarring that they just pops up. There's the stories of Saint Cyprian, of course, the martyrdom and all of those kind of things sometimes. But then there's these stories of Saint Cyprian trying to get with a girl. Why include these?
Again, anyone's guess is as good as mine. Look, those stories, first of all, they seem to serve a narrative function within the text.
Okay.
Those stories, they are quite random.
Yeah.
But they usually appear as context for some sorcery that's going to be talked afterwards. So they tell this story of Cyprian doing all these horrifying things, and he uses particular magic in doing that.
Yeah.
And then after the story, you have the magic that he used. So there is a narrative purpose to them. And the stories are they have their own individual quirks, but they're I would probably repetitive. It's Saint Cyprian, the lecherous sorcerers. Once a woman, people try to get in his way, and he messes everybody up with magic.
Yeah,
and he gets the woman.
Yeah.
This is a portrayal of supposedly a pre-Christian Cyprian. So the Portuguese books also contain a reduced version of the story of Saint Cyprian of Antioch. So placing these narratives within the text it's kind of a callback to the opening of the book. So this was an evil sorcerer back in the day. Right. So there is some context like that. But otherwise, I have to say that I have no idea where these stories come from. Yeah. It might be that they were small, like chapbooks or pamphlets that were in circulation in the 19th century about Cyprian. I know there were a few like those in Brazil, the stories of Saint Cyprian and the adventures of Saint Cyprian, like a Captain Kidd kind of thing, like this folk hero.
Yeah,
I know there are a couple of those in Brazil. I don't know if they existed in Portugal, from where these stories could have been lifted, because the 19th century editorial market of books of Saint Cyprian is a wild country. Yeah. People were stealing everything from everybody at all times. There were no copyrights. So if you published something that was fairly popular, somebody's going to republish it eventually. So maybe it came from these chapbooks that might have been circulating. I don't know where they came from.
Yeah,
is what I'm trying to say. They make sense somehow in the book, but their origin is really unknown.
Okay. Okay, yeah, it's all part of what makes these things so fascinating. Because I know a lot of people when they get these grimoires, immediately you want to go to the spells, you want to go to the rituals, you want to go to the exorcism of Saint Cyprian, but it's part of the package. And what makes them truly incredible cultural artifacts, and even particularly with the more contemporary books of Saint Cyprian, is that it shows to, in a way, that these books were trying to appeal to people as well as not just be functional instructional guides, but they're just meant to appeal in a somewhat incredibly broad way. Would you agree with that? Or is this?
Yeah. There is a commercial concern to all of this.
Yeah.
And there is that, and there is all these. I don't want to sound like romantic about it, but then the history of the books implies these scars on it.
Okay.
That you have these artifacts, these strange things that pop up of nowhere that if you're just reading them, they don't make sense. They add character to it, but they don't make sense. But then when you look at the history, you say, oh shit, that one sentence that's there, like a dangling something there that doesn't make sense. This has a 300-year-old history, and it contains all these scars, all these marks that just they retell its history. And the commercial aspect of the 19th century books is really a major aspect of that there is this moment when books became cheap, printing press became available, people were interested in magic, and literacy was rising. So let's pump this full of insanity, and let's make these new books. And sure, yeah, it's a mark of that. It's a step in that story.
For sure, definitely. In your translation of The Sorcerer's Treasure, you stated that some of the magic within that book might be from the continent of Africa. But we had a recent conversation in working on this episode before it was recorded. You basically said this might not be the case. It might be due to something. But are you able to talk the listeners through how this might have happened?
Oh, sure. No,
Yeah.
I have no problems admitting my academic shortcomings. Sure. No, this is an inevitable aspect of academic research into history, which will hit you harder when you're not really an academic, like I was.
Well, you said that you. Sorry to interrupt. You said that you never expected expected the Sorcerer's Treasure to be a one-off, and then you just be like, done, it's here, and then you can move on with your thing. But it didn't. But that wasn't the case. So I understand. Years later,
still talking about it. But anyway. So when I was reading the Book of Saint Cyprian, and translating it, among these smaller, like loose sorceries and recipes, there were a few that had these particular forms of incantation, particular preoccupation, which were slightly consistent between them, which is saying something because the book is not consistent at all. So there were these bits that made sense together. And while trying to figure them out, I was reading some academic literature on magic in Portugal and Brazil. And I noticed that these same incantations and this same sort of structure were frequent in the magic practices of some Brazilian slaves, African indentured servants. Some of them in Brazil and in Lisbon. Lisbon, we did obviously we had slavery. It wasn't as massive as in Brazil. There was like a pre-industrial, like the American model is a pre-industrial model of slavery. Portugal, we had slaves obviously, but it wasn't that explosive. So, but the in academic literature, I was finding these same incantations associated with these non-white magic practitioners. Which my initial approach would be, well, I mean, I have this thing here in the Book of Saint Cyprian, and apparently these were being used a couple hundred years ago by these African individuals. There should be a connection, obviously. I'm assuming this might be just some African magic that's getting in here, and no, I had no issue with that. A book as historically complex as the Book of Saint Cyprian, obviously you would have things coming out of everywhere, so that's fine. So I made that claim. Said, okay, there are procedures here. The only evidence I found outside of this book of them is among African magic practitioners. I'm going to say it's African.
Right.
Fair enough. Now, as time moved on, again, working on my current PhD, studying magic in the early modern period in Portugal, I came to the realization that these same magical procedures that I was finding among African practitioners weren't solely African. I was being myopic because scholarship was myopic. There is a lot of magic studies, academic magic studies, happening in Brazil. And those individuals, and I'm not saying that they're bad scholars, they do their thing and they're right to do their thing. So they will study the Portuguese Inquisition, but as a method to study Brazil, because the Lisbon Inquisition had jurisdiction over Brazil. If you want to study Brazilian magic, you need to go to the Lisbon Inquisition. It's fair.
Yeah.
So the issue was that there was some myopia going on because the magic system that these individuals were using was not solely African. It was Ibero-American urban folk magic. The same exact procedures that these guys were using were being used by individuals of all races everywhere in Spain, Portugal, Brazil, South America, in the wider Ibero-American world near urban centers. You had individuals doing these procedures. I know that now.
Yeah.
So while my claim that it's African magic here, look, that's wrong. What we have here is a remnant of this wider phenomenon of urban folk magic that was omnipresent in the Ibero-American world. And in some ways it still is. You can find traces of it in Kimbanda, you can find traces of it everywhere if you know what to look for.
Yeah.
So it's not so much African magic, it's simply urban folk magic as widespread as it was in the Iberian Peninsula. So that was the confusion.
Yeah. There's a really wonderful YouTube video that José has up in his channel called "The City Between Heaven and Hell." It'll be in the show notes. Everybody, please check it out. It's an incredibly fascinating. All of the things on José's YouTube are incredible. So I highly recommend everybody check those out as well. Particularly just with this idea of the kind of folk Catholicism that springs forth these certain ideas, and it's so cool and incredibly fascinating. What happened to the Cyprianic grimoires once they started to reach, huge air quotes here, the New World, places like Brazil and Mexico, as well as did what happened there also come back to affect what occurred in Iberia?
Well, look, sure. Short answer, yes.
Yeah.
I know a few things about the Brazilian Cyprian books. Again, I'm not. My area of expertise is Portugal, so right. From what I know, when the current Book of Saint Cyprian, the 3-part book that I translated, when that gets published, it gets transported to Brazil rather quickly. The Portuguese National Library has a few Brazilian editions, which are just the regular Portuguese book.
Right.
They get transported over there, and I'm not sure when, but they very quickly begin. The population over there very rapidly and very eagerly, and rightfully so, they appropriate it as they should, because it's magic. It's supposed to move with time and with context. And very quickly they start mixing and matching it with other grimoires coming also from Europe. They started adding their own new material and content. They started adding some more urban folk magic, which again made me believe it was more African than just general Ibero-American. They start making new variations. Then you start having Spiritism coming in.
Yeah.
You start having people saying, "Oh shit, I'm talking with Saint Cyprian right now. I'm going to write a new book." All that sort of thing, and it becomes a very lively, a very organic, a very a thing that's in continuous growth over there. It explodes in a variety of new versions. Collecting those is a challenge. I've tried. I've given up.
It's so many.
Good on you. I love that you're doing this, but my bank account is limited.
Yeah.
So that happens over there.
Yeah.
And now the interesting thing And again, this is a very specific historical event. Now, the Book of Saint Cyprian gets published in its current form in the 19th century, and it lives on for a while. It gives rise to a few offshoots over here. We have a very interesting period where we have these occultist almanacs and pamphlets that are basically just small publications that are mining the content of the Book of Saint Cyprian into smaller forms. So it's generating its own offshoots over here. But then we get to the early 20th century, and there's a whole political mess happening. The end result of which is a dictatorship is established in Portugal. What was it, 1932? It gets formal. It formulates itself into the Estado Novo, the new state. Before that, it was a military dictatorship. Then it becomes something else. But anyway, 1932. By 1939, the Book of Saint Cyprian is outlawed. It's an illegal object. While the dictatorship, our dictator was a vocal Catholic, but he didn't. He was a shrewd individual. You can't be a dictator without being a shrewd individual.
No.
he knew how to play the game with the church, so he could mine the church for authority, but not allow it to gain power over the state, which is a very tightrope to walk, and he walked it admirably. But anyway, some of the things he did were religious in nature, such as prohibiting the Book of Saint Cyprian and a few other magic texts. As far as I can tell, during the period of the Estado Novo, the books do die out. They disappear from Portugal. The only instance I found of a Book of Saint Cyprian getting published in Portugal was 1973. So
holy smokes!
Yes, from 39 to 73, we got nothing.
Wow.
And the dictatorship ended in 74, so the following year. So it was already crumbling. Yeah. So there was a bit more leeway, and we had a particular guy. The guy who published it was a really interesting character, and he founded the Editora Aphrodite, and he was publishing everything. He was publishing Mazoche, and he was publishing Evola and the Marquis de Sade, and collections of medieval erotic Portuguese poetry, which is really raunchy. Nice. It's really they wrote stuff back then makes me blush. And they had the satirical and offensive poetry, which is you would be surprised at how little swearing has evolved from the medieval period. They're using shit I haven't even heard about. We are losing our capacity to offend. They were poets back then. Jesus. For sure. So he was publishing all of that. Yeah. And he published the Book of Saint Cyprian. He got arrested, not by the book, but just by being himself.
Okay. Nice.
He got arrested. He was, it was common that he would be arrested. I don't think he minded. I think it was part of his business model.
Do you think that, do you think it was for commercial reasons? It was just to make money? It was a notorious book. Let's put it out, make some money, or?
I think it was a bit of that. I think it was also a form of performance art. Getting arrested was his art form.
Okay.
Anyway, that's the only publication of the Book of Saint Cyprian during the dictatorship. Then eventually, 74, the dictatorship falls. There's a bit of a rough patch, political rough patch over there. Nobody knew if we were going to fall into civil war. Nobody knew if Reagan wanted to invade Portugal. There were talks about they wanted to take the Azores.
Oh.
But the Portuguese, the American ambassador in Portugal at the time was the head of the CIA. Very suspicious. and he told Reagan to chill. Not Reagan, sorry, Nixon.
Nixon, okay.
Devil by a different name, sorry.
That's right.
Nixon, he told him to chill. Portugal is not a communist country. Just take it easy. And we built ourselves back up. So anyway, no more censorship, no more anything. We can publish the Book of Saint Cyprian all we want. And the first books of Saint Cyprian I find after after 74, they are similar to the 39 books in terms of content. But if you analyze the language, carefully, you realize that it's actually Brazilian Portuguese, which has slight nuances that aren't always obvious. But if you pay attention, you notice that the books published after 74 are actually Brazilian books, which seems that publishers wanting to publish the Book of Saint Cyprian, instead of going through the trouble of trying to find an old version, just went across the Atlantic. They were still being published there. Just grab one of those and publish it over here, which is, it's fine. So that was the dominant version of the Book of Saint Cyprian. Attached to that, we also had, for a long time, several Brazilian versions being published over here with Portuguese sources, with Portuguese publishers. But then more recently, I think, 2015 perhaps, later than that, probably 2018, there was because you never run out of books of Saint Cyprian, they're always in print. But there was a publisher that came up and it published the Book of Saint Cyprian, and for the first time since 39, they went to the trouble of going to the Portuguese National Library and picking up a pre-39 version, and now they're republishing it. Okay. And it seems to be dominating the market right now. So there was that Brazilian period, and now we're back to the pre-39 version of the book. There was a new edition, I think, just came out a couple of months ago.
Oh,
yeah. So it's still happening.
Very cool.
That's the story.
Nice. I don't know the history of particularly of the Sulfurino, the more Spanish-based Cyprians in places like Mexico. From what I understand, there are digitalized copies of the Libro de San Cipriano in Spanish, and it looks like it's almost it's exactly the same. I don't think there was any kind of like a disruption of those being produced in Mexico. But again, I don't know the true history of it. Something worth looking into for sure. I don't have the time. I don't know about you, but you start off your 2014 translation of the Sorcerer's Treasure by talking about the reputation of the Book of Saint Cyprian, and you mentioned it a little bit beforehand. How did this reputation come to be? Just word of mouth? And
that's I don't have an exact answer for that.
Okay,
I do know for a while I thought it might have been a dictatorship thing.
Yeah,
that as the book got banished, and just the state or the church instilled fear. But I don't believe that anymore, because one of the references I found in the late 18th century, one of the denunciations I found were about a couple of guys who were just walking around at night, and they heard somebody performing a treasure finding ritual. And they explicitly mentioned that they were hiding and listening, and they mentioned that as the person doing the ritual said the name Saint Cyprian, that they were afraid and they ran away. So whatever, people were already afraid of books of Saint Cyprian in the late 18th century. How this happened, it's anyone's guess. I mean, magic tends to, as a non-normalized activity, frequently exclusionary activity from mainstream society, I guess, could be simply church sponsored fear-mongering. But I cannot pinpoint a moment. I cannot pinpoint a reason. I can say that by the 18th century, people were already afraid of books of Saint Cyprian for some reason. I doubt that they would tell the same urban legends that we were telling each other in the 90s.
Right.
But they were already afraid of them back then. But the reason for that, it's anyone's guess.
Right. It's strange that there is this reputation, and I can only speak from my own experience of the time that I spent in Mexico. I would walk into these artículos religiosos stores, and I'd be looking for Cyprianic material, and I'd go first of all to the person that runs the shop and be like, "Do you have anything for Saint Cyprian?" And they'd say no. And then I'd just stick around and I'd look, and they'd have things there. It's not that they forgot about it. They just they just didn't want me to find it or to have it. And I understand there's cultural taboos around these sort of things. It's the copy that I held up. Unfortunately, listeners can't see it. The copy that I got when I purchased it from the person in Morelia, Mexico, I paid the price for it. And then when I finally flipped through it, the actual price written in the book was 3 times less than what I actually paid for it. There's always the gringo tax. Cyprian has, and it maybe I'm just trying to notice too much, but when I walk into these stores asking about Cyprian, there's always this kind of like they kind of take a little bit of a step back. So there's this currency to Cyprian that exists within Catholic cultures to this day.
There's an implicit association with black magic for some reason.
Yeah.
The book isn't really all that. Isn't all? It's not. It seems to be more of a cultural projection than anything else. More this imaginary cultural item that the books that you find. It's projected upon them, but they don't really correspond to the image that people have of them.
Yeah.
And you don't need to even go to a botanica or to a religious item store. I had that experience in universities that I want to give a talk and I'm talking about the Book of Saint Cyprian. People are freaking out. I was invited to give a talk on them 2019, and the person who was organizing the talk went to this is the University of Porto, the philosophy department.
Right.
And she went to the humanities faculty, to the library, to ask for some books of Saint Cyprian just to have around during the talk. People were shitting their pants over it. They didn't want to touch them. And this is a university,
right?
Where a faculty of humanities, where people, our tools are books. It's ink on paper.
Yeah.
And they were afraid of ink on paper. They were afraid of a printed book. Look, I find it interesting.
Yeah.
That this exists. Yeah. It's also very frustrating that we are scholars. We are supposed to be a couple of steps ahead of this.
Yeah. Yeah.
We are supposed to, if we need to acknowledge our fear, if it's real, but we need to be able to walk past it. Yeah. That's our job.
Right. Yeah. It was always funny because I did eventually I bought a statue of Saint Cyprian from it. I asked around for like a month and over a period of years to try and find a nice sized statue of Saint Cyprian in Mexico. And nobody had it. Nobody had a statue except for the main church in the city of Morelia. I went there, I was like, just on a whim, I was like, do you guys have a statue of St. Cyprian? Yep, there it is. It's behind everything. They dusted it off, but it was there. They gave it to me. I was like, here you go. Perfect. All right. When I brought it home, though, my mother, when she would invite people over, I knew people saw it because they saw it and they knew exactly who it was. They could recognize Cyprian. They're like, okay, why does your son have this thing just next to his pile of clothes? There is a reputation. I find it incredibly fascinating, as do you, I'm sure. You said when you cracked open the Book of Saint Cyprian for the first time that you were disappointed by the content.
Yeah, precisely.
Yeah,
it's not what you expect.
Yeah, you're expecting to have this great satanic book of child killing, and there is some gruesome stuff in particularly some of in the Spanish one. I think there's killing cats, and
that's the content that's also common to the Portuguese one. Yeah, I'm not gonna say it's all puppy dogs and sunshines.
Yeah,
but it's not. The stories you hear of it is literally the devil springs out,
right?
And I'm looking at treasure hunting for some reason,
right? You go to this part, and then you go behind the fountain, and then you do the spell, and then there's your treasure. It's right there. It's literally in a city. It's right there. There's just everybody hasn't found it yet, or maybe they have, but fascinating. I have one last question for you, José. Let's say some folks are extremely interested in checking out a book of Saint Cyprian to use for personal practice, to take some of the things from within. Sure. Is there any advice that you would give them before they start interacting with these books?
Well, yeah. It would depend on the background of the individual in question, I would assume.
Okay.
Magic practice contemporarily is strongly Anglo-American, meaning Protestant in background. People tend to forget that. They think magic is separated. It's a problem with this radical separation of magic and religion, which is false. So it is contemporary magic practice is mostly a Protestant type of framework. And when you're looking at a Cyprian book, independently of its Spanish or Portuguese or even Scandinavian, the background is Catholic. So you will have a strong shock on the types of preoccupations, on the types of methodologies, on the types of implicit cosmologies, although very few people care about that. And you don't need to care about that if you want to practice magic, honestly. So there is that. That is the first thing I would tell somebody, that realize that you are stepping in. If they come from this Anglo-American background, you are stepping into somebody else's culture. Just because we're all white,
Yeah.
doesn't mean we're exactly the same. So you need to be aware of that. Not for my sake, for your sake, if you want to be able to navigate this with some adequacy. No, it's if the person involved was a bit, um, if they were, I've had people who heard stories of the Book of Saint Cyprian, never read it, weren't from the culture, were scared of it. I do advise, look, even if it's just a panacea, just just do a bit of a ritual, do something, because and I don't want to sound dismissive, because it's my job to, it's part of my profession to not engage personally with these sorts of things. Um, but if you're sensitive to, let's say, spiritual influence, and again, I'm not saying I'm not this. It's not. It's my job is I shouldn't get involved in that sort of discourse, but I do have friends that are involved in it, and I did come from that background, so I'm not a dick. I do understand the preoccupation. So if you are spiritually sensitive somehow, and if you have preoccupations about the spiritual load that a particular object might have, this is one of those objects. This is, from a cultural perspective, this is a cursed book. So if that's the type of person you are, make yourself a bit of a ritual. um, if they're Catholic, I would advise them just to ask their patron saint to protect them. If they're not Catholic, best of luck to you. Um, so yeah, it's that sort of approach. I can't give you practical advice on a book which is inherently impractical.
Right.
It is my experience that the contemporary Cyprian books, you are supposed to, as a practitioner, you are supposed to figure out your way around it. It's not a step-by-step instruction manual. It's a complicated thing with several elements that don't make sense, and you need to navigate yourself through it and find sense in it. So I can't give practical advice. I can give just a approach advice. Just be aware of what you're looking into. Be prepared that you won't understand it. First of all, even if you're Catholic, you won't understand it. Um, and be aware of all of that. And I've had this. If you buy my version, don't complain to me. I'm just a translator.
Right. Definitely. Cyprian seemed to have had a moment over the last 15 years within contemporary magic, with the publishing of your book, The Sorcerer's Treasure, Jake Stratton Kent's work, Dr. Alexander Cummins, and on and on and on. What do you see the future of the fascination with Cyprian? Do you think it's going to die out? Do you think that this was just a fashion again, and then things go a little bit quiet, or do you see that that Cyprian continues to go strong for at least another 15 years?
There's a clear issue of fashion going on.
Yeah.
And you can tell that just by looking at the past 10 years, that there are peaks and there are valleys. I noticed a peak in interest in books of Saint Cyprian and in Saint Cyprian in general in 2017.
Yeah.
I remember clearly. You can usually tell by, if you're in a couple of Facebook groups, if you follow a couple of blogs, people will around this same time period, September, people will start posting about Saint Cyprian because it's the feast day on the 16th.
That's when
And
this episode's coming out. Yay!
right, so there you go. And usually you can track how much people are paying attention to Saint Cyprian in September. And 2017 was a real peak. Everybody had a blog post about it.
Right.
It kind of died down since then. But in the meantime, and there are a few things I can talk about. Like, for example, and this is information I have access to that I understand other people don't, which is I have access to my own sales records.
Okay.
The Book of Saint Cyprian, no book ever sells more than when it comes out. That's normal. That's just the nature of the publishing industry. Even still, the Book of Saint Cyprian throughout the past 10 years has been a steady sale, which is unusual. This only happens if a book somehow becomes a part of whatever topic it's about, if it becomes a part of the canon. If the only way a book of magic is a steady sale is if new people becoming interested in magic think that they should buy it, like they should buy the Book of the Law, like they should buy the Key of Solomon, like it becomes a part of the canon, this type of stuff that you're supposed to have if you're interested in this. So I don't see it going away. It probably will not have the same popularity as it had like in 2017, but I think it's here to stay. Also because in the meantime, and I've actually recently there's a very good other podcast. I'm gonna advertise one of your rivals.
Sure.
Magic in the US, a very good podcast. They're also doing a Saint Cyprian episode, and they're particularly interested in the American manifestations of this.
Okay, cool.
Because there are American manifestations. There are, in the meantime, there have been orders formed. The Order of Saint Cyprian of Antioch is a thing. It's an institution centered around this idea of Saint Cyprian of Antioch. I'm not a member. I find it fascinating that people are making an order. I'm academically interested in it. Then you have guys with very relevant internet profile, like Jason Miller had created his own magic school every year, every few months he's talking about it, and people are joining the Black School of Saint Cyprian. That's Jason Miller, a set of classes that he teaches. So this seems to be fairly well established. Apart from this, I assume that there are other more or less organized or more or less loose organizations that now have Saint Cyprian as a patron. So at least that will survive for a few years. I can't say how long, but for the time being, it seems to have created somewhat of a healthy niche among magical practitioners. And speaking of ups and downs, this year so far, there seems to be a bump. It's not 2017, but there is added interest to it. Not just as a case in point, this podcast.
Yep.
There are lots of publications coming up, lots of interest. I've been getting emails all the time, so we have a minor bump here, but this seems to continue itself. I assume at least for 10 more years, for sure, this will still be around. I can't say much beyond that.
Okay. Fantastic. I have to say, this has just been so wonderful. And going through all this material again, it's incredibly fascinating to me. Please, José, tell us what's going on in your world. What's next? You have a bunch of things. I mean, obviously, The Sorcerer's Treasure it's one of my favorite books. I have a hardcover of it. It's never far away. I just think it's such a wonderful book. It's just fun to hold. There's not a lot of books that I'm like, I need to get the hardcover of that book. That is one. We've also done The Precious Apothecary, not Cyprian related, but the introduction to that book, everybody should read. I think it's wonderful, as well as some of the other Cyprianic materials that you've had. What's going on? What are you publishing next? Is there something that's Cyprian related or not? Tell us what's going on in your world over the next couple of years, perhaps, if you can.
No, sure, yeah. Well, first of all, I'm about to defend my PhD thesis
Right.
on learned magic in Portugal in the early modern period. This thesis will be made available to the public, PDF. It's a 700-page long
Oh my God.
story of magic in Portugal. It touches on everything we mentioned, 17th, 16th century, a bit of the 18th century, not the contemporary stuff.
Yeah.
So if you want a gigantic cross-section of what is magic in Portugal during the 17th century, that's coming up.
Nice.
I still have to defend it though, although I'm not expecting that much trouble. But that's going to be available, and then eventually there will be a commercial version of that, which
Cool.
might have a couple of 100 pages more. So
Nice.
it's going to be yeah. I like long books, in case that hasn't been made obvious.
Me too.
Yeah. So that thesis touches upon the presence of several grimoires in Portugal. It completely covers the whole issue of Ibero-American urban folk magic, deals with the overlaps between learned magic and folk magic, which is from where the Cyprian books come from. And they are not the only books that come out of that. They are just the ones who survive. Treasure hunting is all of that, all of it. Then besides that, which was that was my job for a while, I have technically it's already been published, a very small monograph on some medieval texts on fairies.
Okay.
The medieval, the Book of Lineages of Count Dom Pedro has a couple of. It's a book of lineages, which is they tend to be quite boring, but that one has a couple of stories which are about these fairies that create these noble houses, and they're really interesting stories. I really love, and some of them have ramifications up until the contemporary period. Again, I'm never too far away from Cyprian books. There is a Spanish Cyprian book that I believe has a mention to one of these fairies.
Okay.
So I talked about that there. There's a Portuguese theosophist who also writes a poem about one of these fairies, and it connects to English demonology from the early modern period. So it's tracking the story of these fairies throughout time and how they end up influencing magic and mystical authors. So that's I think that's technically already published. I think you can buy the hardback from Hadean Press.
Yes.
The paperback should be available soon, I hope. Then besides that, I already submitted, and it's already accepted for publication again with Hadean, that other weird Cyprian book I mentioned with Lucy Fuge. That one is on the tracks to be published. I suppose it's going to be published sometime during next year. It's not a very long book, but it's a solid one. It contains a summary, not a summary, but it contains the history of the books of Saint Cyprian, as I understand it until this point, because you need to know the entire story in order to make sense of that book. So if you want something that contains, besides the spectacularly weird magic book, it contains the entire story of the Cyprian books as I understand it. Awesome. That book will contain that, besides a whole bunch of other things. So that's for publication. And then I have a few other plans, but those are kind of dependent on the financing I find, because I just finished my PhD. I need to start applying for postdocs, and I'm already applying for postdocs. And the amount of free time I have to work on certain material is dependent on me having money to work on it.
Sure.
But I can say that I'm right now working on another treasure hunting book that I found during my PhD research. I found it tucked in something called the prosecutor's notebooks. It's the Inquisition sometimes produced these. But every document that the Inquisition produced that did not result in a formal trial, they would stash them together in these gigantic volumes. Right. They're called the prosecutor's notebooks. I found a magic book tucked in there.
Huh.
And I'm working on that magic book right now. It belonged to the Chamberlain of the Portuguese prince, who was a treasure hunter. And besides his magic book, he also wrote. There's a manuscript in the Portuguese National Library that he wrote about his adventures of treasure hunting. So he was not shy. And it's a book of treasure hunting written in the first person, and then you have the magic book that he was using.
Oh man, that is going to be so dope! Wow.
When it comes to treasure hunting, I don't know if anybody has ever found a document like that. It's going to be a really cool book.
Yeah.
I'm working on that right now, and then after that, I'm planning on publishing a couple more. I also found a couple of astral magic books. in an obscure archive in the middle of nowhere in Spain. A couple of astral magic books. They're written in Latin. They're a bit hard to make out, but I think I can turn them around. So I'm right now. Basically, what I'm doing is just all the random things I found during my PhD that I did not use for my thesis.
Right.
I'm working them into smaller books, and I'll be doing that, I guess, for a couple of years. I also found like a whole bunch of what you can call folk magic grimoire, just collections of folk of like prayers and folk recipes and a whole bunch of things that just your random farmer who knew how to read and write would collect. I have a bunch of those. I have a magic book that is completely pictorial. So the guy who wrote it was illiterate, so he just made a book filled with symbols and things, and he claimed the devil taught him how to read it. And I have that book. I plan on publishing that eventually. So a whole bunch of manuscripts I'm working on right now.
Do you sleep at all? Like, is that
Sometimes.
Yeah. Oh my God. I don't know. That might be that you might be the guest where it's like, I'm the most excited. Usually when I ask people that question, like, I've got a couple of things I can't really talk about it right now. I am jazzed for everything that is going to be coming out. That is fantastic. As I mentioned, everybody, José has a fantastic YouTube channel. It will be in the show notes here. You're still going to be putting stuff up there on the YouTube?
Yeah, my YouTube channel is, I'm not a YouTuber, right?
Right.
What I put up there is conference presentations.
Okay.
Because every time I'm a professional scholar, I go to conferences a few times a year. I usually record myself giving my presentation, and then I just match the sound with the PowerPoint, and I just upload it. It's not professional. I stutter. I make plenty of mistakes, but what I said at the conference is what's there, and I just make that available to the audience. So whenever I go to a conference, I make a recording. Actually, if you're releasing this on the 16th, I'm doing a talk on the 16th, not for an academic audience, but for just people interested on Saint Cyprian stuff, and I'm going to be uploading that. So every time I go to a conference, I upload something. So
Amazing.
maybe at the most 4 videos per year. That's all there is.
Yeah, but they're still great. They're wonderful presentations as well, and some of the documents in there. I loved how you had a grimoire that had certain symbols and crosses, and you're just like, "Yep, that's the medal of Saint Benedict." It's just like that's it right there, and you can see it right there. I think that really helps people, so it's really wonderful. I want everybody to check it out. Your academia.edu. What can people find there? There's some great articles in there.
Yeah, basically that's probably where you can go to find the most amount of content I've produced and published. There are obviously some limitations. I'm not going to upload my books in there because there is a direct correlation between my sales and my capacity to pay rent. So
Yes.
bear with me. But when it comes to smaller publications, small papers, small chapters I might publish, it all ends up there. So if people who want to follow my work, that's the safest place to go to. Yeah, that's basically it. That's where I that's my main online storage of content.
For sure.
Yeah.
You also have a Patreon. Tell the folks what they can get when they join up to your Patreon.
Yeah. The Patreon is a complicated issue, particularly right now, because I started. It's the second time I've organized the Patreon. I started participating in that platform when I wanted to write the Book of Saint Cyprian, which is a very long book, and the content for it was spread out through a bunch of archives and libraries. And I didn't have a job at the time, or a permanent, or a position, or a scholarship. So I just opened the Patreon and just said, look, I want to write a giant book on St. Cyprian. Who wants to help? And to the credit of the community, a whole bunch of people came, and they paid me to write. And I wrote the book, and it was a great success. Then I took that down and then reopened it when I started my current PhD. Because when I started, I didn't have a scholarship. I was still applying for stuff. It's getting a scholarship and signing up for a PhD. Sometimes it's two different things. So I signed up. I was still struggling to find some money to do the research. And in the meantime, I opened it and said, look, if I'm writing a thesis on magic, again, whoever wants to help me, you can help me. And people helped me. And that Patreon is really simple, because obviously it's supposed to help me with my job. It's not supposed to be my job.
Right.
And I mostly just write monthly updates. I try to make them of a decent size, about 5,000 words. So it's something that you can spend a few minutes reading every month. And it's just it's what I call progress reports. It's just saying, look, this month I went to this archive, I found this, I found that, I went to this conference, I talked to these people. Readers say I'm very funny, uh, and very witty in the way I write things, and it's just that and look, it's and if you sign up, you can read about my arch of of horror and depression, as every PhD goes through. You can I write about my mental breakdowns, and some posts are very dark.
Yeah. Okay.
Look, it's what happened that month
Yeah.
in relation to my work. This is what I'm talking about, and I tend to be as honest as I can. Um, uh, yeah, well, there's that. Yeah, that's basically what the Patreon is. It's, look, if you want to help me.
Yeah.
This is all I'm offering. It's an insight into this academic life. This how do you study magic? How do you look into these things, and the inherent human difficulties that come from this, the sleepless nights and the stress and the grinding of the teeth and all that.
Yeah.
And by the way, this is the important part.
Yeah.
As I mentioned, I'm about to defend my thesis, and I have made the decision that by the end of the year, I will discontinue that Patreon, because I opened it to help me with my work. My work is done. Now, if somebody wants to jump in the meantime and give me $1 or $2, I would appreciate it, because academic life is very, you don't have much job security, and I will spend a considerable amount of months without an income while I apply for postdocs. So anybody who wants to help in the meantime, I'm obviously very thankful for it, but don't feel obliged to it. And do know that by the end of the year, I'm going to discontinue it. And then maybe in the future reopen it, depending on my prospects of income.
Nice. Fantastic. I will have links to all of José's books and all of the relevant Cyprianic material that they've put out over the years at the show notes to this episode at whatmagicisthis.com. Trust me, if you want to learn more about Saint Cyprian of Antioch and their relation to magic, the show notes for this one are going to be pretty special. They're going to be pretty good. So please head to whatmagicisthis.com to get all of those show notes, and as well to find all of José's great work on the Book of Saint Cyprian. Say you like what I'm doing here at What Magic Is This, and you'd like to show your support in some way. Well, I've got a few ways, and they have just expanded, as a lot of you probably are already aware, but I want to go through some of the best ways of supporting me. The best way is the first way of supporting me. Of course, this thing I say in every one of these episodes that I do, the best way to support me is through Patreon. That is patreon.com/whatmagicisthis, or head to whatmagicisthis.com and click on any number of the Patreon links there. Apparently, these little sign-offs are getting quite long, so I don't want to take up too much of your time, but just to say, the Patreon is awesome. It's basically a whole different podcast. I've got episodes about saints and gods and all gnomes. Again, I did an episode about gnomes. I did an episode about, as it applies to this episode, I did an episode about Saint Cyprian myself and how to magically think about Saint Cyprian and what Saint Cyprian means to contemporary magicians, myself included. It's an hour and a half. So if you want more Saint Cyprian, you have to head over to my Patreon to get a whole other episode about Saint Cyprian. And I truly think that it's one of the best things I've ever done. I know a lot of people say that kind of stuff. I think most of my Patreon episodes is my greatest work. And so it's only $7 American a month. Everybody else is raising their prices. I'm not. still $7. Come on over to Patreon to get just a completely different show, and it's amazing. People really love it. More show notes there about Saint Cyprian. So basically, if you listen to this episode and you head to my Patreon and listen to the Cyprian episode, you are going to have the best well-rounded education on Saint Cyprian that you could ever want, if that is indeed something that you want. So my Patreon is amazing. Gives you access to a Discord community that is super helpful and amazing there as well. But I also have videos on the Patreon. It's a whole different thing, and it's great. And it goes to keep this as my day job. This is my job. I wake up and I do work on the podcast, and things are getting a little bit dicey out there financially. But if you can see your way to supporting me, it's only $7. That's nothing. You can't buy anything for $7 these days. So I would greatly love to see your support on Patreon. It truly keeps me alive and keeps this podcast going, and it keeps me doing what I do because I like to do it, and I hope that you like listening to it. And I can't do it without your help. And I know a lot of people will go to my Patreon and be like, "Oh, Doug's got 800 followers." No, I have less than half of that. Basically, I've got close to 400 people supporting me right now, which seems like a lot, but could always use more. And any help would be appreciated in that regard. So patreon.com/whatmagicisthis, or head to whatmagicisthis.com. Find my Patreon links there, and please support if you can. Just keep this podcast thing going and keep it ad-free. So let's talk about another way of supporting me, which is PayPal. Head to whatmagicisthis.com, click on the PayPal link. Any amount helps. I'll just say that. Don't want to make too much of it. Not a lot of folks use the PayPal thing anymore, so I'm just not going to promulgate it as much. Somebody was like, "Doug, you say the word promulgate a lot in your videos," and they started doing promulgate counts on YouTube. So if you're listening to this, thanks, bud. Stay cool. I bet you're a real pleasant person in real life. YouTube listener, YouTube watcher listener who counts the amount of times I say promulgate on my episodes. Good stuff. Bet you're the life of the party. Anyhow, PayPal, great to support. $5, $10, $20, $2,000, any amount. It just goes right back to keeping this podcast ad-free and pays some of my bills. That's another way of supporting. Merchandise, head to whatmagicisthis.com. Click on the menu there. Head to merchandise, shirts, mugs. There's tote bags, wall hangings, throw pillows, phone cases, all of that stuff. It's got some logos that I've made, and some other people have helped me with logos. Amazing. I'd love to see it. Don't see a lot of money from that, but still love to see if you grab some stuff. Somebody actually grabbed 3 t-shirts recently, so that was cool. So thank you so much for doing that. And the final way of supporting me is the best way of helping yourself and helping me, and that is going to the What Magic Is This podcast bookshop. So I have a virtual bookshop in which basically almost 90% of the books that I recommend in the show notes and on the podcast here, you can go there and find all of these books that I've recommended. And every time you buy them, that they help out independent bookstores around North America. And they also give me a little bit of they give me a cut. So I get a couple of dollars if you buy a book through there. How will you find this? Well, you can head to whatmagicisthis.com, go to the menu. You can find my bookshop there. It just says bookshop, or click the bookshop button. You can also just go to whatmagicisthis.com and click on the episode button in the menu there, head to the episode, and then basically all of the book links that you want. If there's a book there that you want to buy, just click that and it'll go straight to my bookshop as well. Just make sure that it says What Magic Is This Podcast Bookshop at the very top when you click buy, and then that helps me out. So you don't even need to go to the online bookshop. You can just go to my website and then click on the book that I have linked there in my episode webpage, and Robert's Your Father's Brother. Or you could just head straight there and go to your internet browser, enter in bookshop.org/shop/whatmagicisthis, all one word, obviously. And you can buy any number of books. And you can also just see all of the books that I recommend on the show. I'm slowly chipping away at it. We're doing really good. I actually have somebody helping me out with it. So it's hopefully going to take me not as long, knock on wood kind of thing. But that's a great way of helping yourself and also helping me, because I know you love books, and books are fantastic. And I know a lot of people are like, "Doug, my bookshelf is now 3 times as large as it once was because I listened to your podcast. And I'm like, great, that's amazing. So if you want to help me out and you want to help out the podcast and you want to help yourself out by grabbing some of the books that I talk about, the best way of doing that is head into the What Magic Is This podcast bookshop. It's a virtual bookshop. Go to the website, find the links there, or head to bookshop.org/shop/What Magic Is This. Because indeed, this is the Books of Magic 3-episode special that we've got going right now. And there's no better way of showing your love for books than grabbing some books that help out bookshops and independent booksellers and helps out your favorite podcaster, right? But again, the best way of supporting me is through this thing called Patreon. Patreon.com/What Magic Is This. But of course, you can find all of the relevant links through my webpage. That is whatmagicisthis.com. Please head there for all of the stuff. I have to say, if folks are interested in Books of Saint Cyprian and Cyprianic grimoires, José's work is the absolute best. The Sorcerer's Treasure, as I said, one of my favorite things. It's got the greatest disclaimer in the history of translated magic books. I love rereading that disclaimer. It's short, but so sweet and so amazing. It is wonderful. Every other book that José has written about Saint Cyprian is well worth getting and looking into. It's just, you just do the absolute best work, and I'm wishing you absolutely the best of luck in defending your PhD and your thesis. I know it's going to go fine. Yeah, we're very lucky to have your work, José, and thank you so much for coming on. And I really hope if some point in the future I was to ask you to come back onto What Magic Is This, you'd be okay to do so.
No, sure, no issue there.
Amazing. Fantastic. Everyone, that are Books of Saint Cyprian and Cyprianic grimoires. Please go out and find José's work. Please go to the show notes for this episode. There's going to be some great stuff there. Get some Cyprian into your life. That's the show, everybody. All right. Take care. This is episode 1 of 3 for the Books of Magic special here on What Magic Is This. Started off with that wily sorcerer, Saint Cyprian of Antioch, later Bishop of Antioch. All right, everybody. I hope you really enjoyed it. We're going to talk at you soon. I want each and every one of you to stay healthy, to stay hopeful, and to stay luminous. Until next time, everyone, take care and goodbye. Bye-bye.